But with all the stories going on around the country, Ferguson, Missouri, Oklahoma, and what we saw in Alabama last Saturday, there's only one man to talk to, only one man, a dear friend of mine, a great friend of the show, from the Huffington Post. You see him on all the big shows around the country. It's our good buddy, Carl Jeffers. Carl, good Friday morning. How are you, pal?
I'm pretty good, Sid. Good to be with you today.
Nice to have you back. Let's before we get to Ferguson and what's going on in Oklahoma, I want to go back to almost a week ago Saturday, 50 years since the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, Selma. I know President Obama spoke. You know, you've been a little critical in that you said, listen, at times when there's been race issues in this country, Obama's had the opportunity to step up, and instead he sounded like Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon. You tell me, the speech the president made in Selma, Alabama last Saturday, and the whole day at that, what was that like for you?
Well, first of all, Sid, I wouldn't have minded so much if he sounded like Lyndon Johnson, because given the times and the age, Lyndon Johnson didn't sound bad, actually, for much of his administration. Right. But you certainly have a point there with Richard Nixon. No question about that one. Listen, I think that without question, the speech and the entire event last Saturday demonstrated the power of the presidency when you have a president, whether he's African-American or not, well, when you have a president who is committed to racial justice, to social equality, to tolerance and diversity in the country, because you can capture the imagination of the American people, and that's what he did last Saturday, and that's what the Obama campaign did when he first ran for president in 2008. And let's not forget that we also had this past summer, we had the anniversary of 50 years of the March on Washington and the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech. And in that ceremony, he reached those same heights. My problem has been that in between these ceremonies and celebrations that we've now had almost 7.5 years, going on 8 years, where he hasn't been proactive as ongoing activity on the part of the president to address the conversation about race that we need in the country. And because of that, we are having to deal with the vestiges of the lack of understanding, and that causes Oklahoma, and that causes Ferguson, and many other situations quite similar around the country. That's where I was disappointed, Sid, that he has not been as proactive as he could have been. And I have used this example. President Obama could have been doing regular fireside chats in the tradition of what Franklin Roosevelt did to help Americans get through the Depression. The fireside chats that Roosevelt didn't put a single dollar into any American's pockets. But what it did do was to make them feel more comfortable about their prospects for the future and about the prospects for the future of the country. And what Obama could have done is, rather than wait for these special events where the personalities oftentimes essentially outweigh and supersede the event itself, and you certainly had that in the March on Washington event where Bill Clinton really stole the show last year above everyone else, in fact, that you would have in these kinds of efforts, regular conversations, a chance for the president to get the message across. And I will repeat again on your show and others that I've done, that his chances are running out. He is about to enter the 8th year of his presidency, and I have maintained in the past, and I maintain it now, is that after Obama leaves office, the next president of the United States will be white. And I maintain that it will be at least 25 years before another African-American will be in a position where they could actually be elected president. So if he doesn't do any of this, and it's pretty late now, then I think that at the very least, history will look back at this administration and say that he missed an opportunity. Now, when it comes to these special events themselves, his rhetoric soars as high as that of Martin Luther King or Laurence Olivier. And that's why he got elected to begin with, because that rhetoric of Obama's, that ability to sing a message that was angelic-like for listeners, was what motivated so many Americans to feel that not only was he a good choice for them to vote for president, but that his presidency was going to be different, and it was going to lead to almost, in some ways, a utopian type of post-racial society. Now, most of us knew that was ridiculous, so that was never going to happen. But it was that kind of fervor, and people have forgotten what's happened. And let me tie in one quick point to Oklahoma. We had a college campus with college students on a bus chanting, "Hang 'em high, let 'em hang from the trees." Let me tell you something, Sid. 8 years ago, in 2008, the most incredible, most visually impressive events held around the country for the Obama presidency campaign were those on the college campuses, where literally tens of thousands of students were marching at 11 p.m. and midnight with candlelights because they were excited about the hope and the future that was represented by the Obama presidency. I would maintain to you, Sid, that in 2008, when Obama was running for president, that young kid on that bus who was chanting, "Hang 'em high, hang 'em from the trees," he wouldn't have been worried about being expelled from school. In 2008, he would have been worried about being expelled from the bus, because the atmosphere and the attitude across the country, in northern universities and in the South, was so excited. They were so enthusiastic about Obama that the other students on the bus, rather than joining in with the phrases, would have, in fact, thrown that guy off the bus. That shows you that we still have a long way to go, and then in some areas, we've retrograded.
So that's the question. That's the question. Then that question becomes, with all the hope you're talking about and the possibilities and the potential for this race kumbaya when Barack took over 7 years ago. The truth is, and we could beat around the bush and we could talk. The truth is, we've gone the other direction. Now, to blame him,
it's gotten worse.
Right? But now to blame him seems somewhat unfair. But hey, guess what? When you're the coach of a good football team and they win, you get the credit. When you're the coach of a bad football team and they lose, you get fired. So, unfortunately, he's the guy.
We don't even have to segue into sports. When the economy's bad, the president gets the blame. When the economy's good, the president gets the credit.
Even though he
doesn't deserve it.
That's exactly right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Incidentally, I'll tell you another punishment. The kid on the bus was expelled from the University of Oklahoma. I'll tell you something that he ought to also have to do. He ought to have to spend a weekend listening to Billie Holiday's recording of Strange Fruit. And that'll break him of this habit of talking about Hang 'em High from a Tree. Because Billie Holiday recorded Strange Fruit, which was a song that she composed and wrote the words to in the early 1950s. And it was essentially to reference the fact that you still had African-American bodies hanging from trees being hung around the country. Not very much then, but she was making reference to the 20s and 30s and even into the early 1940s when it was prevalent throughout the South.
Yeah.
And she was talking about that you look up at the tree, and that was a very strange-looking fruit to be hanging from the tree limbs. They weren't peaches or oranges or apples. And he would understand the pain that he can cause by using phrases like that. And he should, I think, have to listen to Billie Holiday. Not that it's a bad choice, too, for a singer. And we just celebrated her 100th birthday, by the way, this week.
No, she's one of my four favorite female artists of all time: Whitney Houston, Barbra Streisand, Diana Ross, and Billie Holiday. She was great. Hey,
it's funny you mentioned Streisand. By the way, I just never get tired of it. But people, I was listening to the radio just a few days ago, and it played, and it was like I was a long lost friend because I hadn't heard her sing "People" for 10 years, 15 years, and it's just wonderful. It's just like a brand new.
Great song. Carl Jepper's here for a couple more minutes. Let's get to Ferguson, Missouri. We know what's happened there. 6 city officials have either been resigned and or fired. I know some of the public wants more. They want the whole police force disbanded. They want Mayor Knowles to step down as well. But 6 is not a terrible start. Now, on the night with Tom Jackson, the police chief is resigning, and it really wasn't a protest. They keep saying protest. It was more of a celebration. It still got ugly. There was still 2 cops shot that night. Let me bring out to you something that was on Sean Hannity last night. I don't know if you caught this or not, Carl Jeffers, but there was a public community organizer on the streets of Ferguson last night on Hannity who claimed the police killed two of their own to make the black people look evil and give themselves some more power. In other words, let's pawn this off on the African-American community. They shot two of our guys even after we resigned, and they were behind the whole thing. Is that a crazy scenario or a possibility?
Well, it's number one, it's both crazy as a scenario, and it is not a possibility. And furthermore, let me just say this, that I think that without going into specific name-calling or casting aspersions, that the entire media needs to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And by that I mean is that everybody in the media is able to recognize that there is no credibility to a charge like that. And once you recognize that, there is no reason to then essentially provide incendiary flames to creating more tension and more divisiveness by airing this type of charge, baseless, meritless, without credibility. And in fact, once it's aired, there will be more people who will now start to believe it. This goes back to Katrina. Remember when there were those who were suggesting that it was the government who, in fact, blew up the levees and wanted to destroy the African-American and the community in Katrina in New Orleans. This type of rhetoric is counterproductive because there are people who, when they hear it on the air, on TV or on the radio, they then will say, I knew there was something going on around here that I didn't like, or something like that.
Right.
And it feeds into the mistrust.
But then let me give you, because you're defending the cops here, which is nice. But let me give you the white guy, the bad white guy on the street goes, look at this. We gave them what they wanted. The police chief resigned. Everybody's getting fired. And yet they're still shooting us in the street. So that's the other side. You hear that. That's going to make you equally as angry, no?
Well, except that the problem is that, number one, first of all, we didn't give them anything. And that's something that African Americans, that Hispanics have all resented when the mainstream community talks about what we gave them this as opposed to, so since we gave them this, we won't give them that. There are certain rights that are inalienable rights that belong to all Americans, and you or I don't control or decide what rights someone else has or what they don't have, other than to affect the common good and the public welfare. Number two, to be very candid with you, that scenario, in terms of the white guy who thinks that, he's closer to the truth than the other one, scenario which was suggesting that the police shot their own in order to create the scenario. Because what we do know is that this is not someone who is a community activist. This is, as Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States, said yesterday, this is a punk. This is some criminal who has no idea what he was doing in terms of any relationship whatsoever to protesting, to being concerned about human rights, civil rights, or even private personal rights. In fact, he violated all of those principles when he attacked and through force with violence police officers who are there to enforce the law. So he can't claim any mantra of any kind of umbrella of protection based on civility, human rights, or civil rights. He was a punk. He was a criminal. He was a criminal whether there had been a protest or whether there was no protest. No different than someone going out and trying to rob a bank or rob a convenience store. They need to be caught, apprehended, and put in jail.
Tell me this, then. I agree with you.
That's what's going to happen with that guy.
Agreed. Now, tell me this. Again, you're so good. Carl Jeffers. And I appreciate when you come on every single time. I say this every single time because you play it down the middle. I love that about you. Look, at the same time, you're very sensitive towards the African-American community, as you should be, as a guy that, quite frankly, should be looked up to in that community. But on the other hand, you play it right down the middle, which I appreciate. And a lot of guys don't do that today.
Well, it's just that I'm looking at things pragmatically.
Yeah, but listen.
I don't deliberately try to play it down the middle.
Well, you do, though.
I just try to look at things from a common sense perspective that I think is we're lacking on both sides.
Not everybody does that on both sides, exactly. So let me ask you this. What should happen? Again, 6 people have been fired or resigned. Are you in the camp they got to disband the whole police department? The mayor has to resign too. What do you think inevitably has to happen in Ferguson, Missouri to quote unquote make it right?
Well, first of all, let me say something that's positive about what did happen. And this also should be a lesson to Republicans, particularly, because Republicans keep talking about how the Democrats take the black vote for granted, yet they always get 90% of the black vote, and they want to know, how is it that we can't get any of the black vote? Well, I'll tell you why. When you're spending all your time writing letters to mullahs around the world with possibly undercutting the constitutional authority of the president, what Democratic administrations do is reinforce African Americans' commitment and trust in the federal government, which goes all the way back, by the way, to Abraham Lincoln and what he did on behalf of black people. And I don't have to go into those details. You can read it, in the proclamation. Right. But the point is that whether it was FDR with executive orders, whether it was Harry Truman with executive orders, whether it was the Kennedys and the civil rights bills and the attitude that they brought to the White House, or Lyndon Johnson, or Jimmy Carter appointing blacks all over the federal government, or Bill Clinton, who did more for African Americans than any other president since Lincoln, or Lyndon Johnson appointing Supreme Courts. It's Democratic administrations that have done the things that have made African Americans even a bit hopeful about the future, and now Hispanics. Well, in this case, while Republicans are sending protest letters to Iran, the Democrats, under the leadership of the Democratic-appointed attorney generals, have been very fair, and kudos to the Justice Department for the way they handled this. Their first report said they could not find enough evidence to indict Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot
Michael Brown. Right.
Michael Brown in Ferguson. So they were being very fair and objective. They said there was not enough evidence to do that. But they also said, however, what we did find was evidence of a systemic pattern of not only discrimination and even racism, but bias. And that's where this report from the Justice Department, Sid, departed from what we normally hear, because they specifically made reference to examples of bias that show that this is a predominantly a problem that permeates the police forces all over the country. You have, the Justice Department concluded, an environment where African Americans are targeted and singled out specifically for quotas of tickets and fines to be levied against them, to be used to fund the overall operation.
Let me play devil's advocate for one more second, too, because I know exactly what the report said, and I'm okay with them coming down hard on them. If I said to you, but hold on a second. Of course, mostly African-American people are the one who are paying. When 90% of that community is black to begin with, what do you think the numbers are going to tell you?
Well, that's always been used as the excuse, but the problem with that is that it overlooks the fact, doesn't ignore it. It in fact pushes it under the rug. So that's a proactive action in and of itself. But it ignores the fact that even with the statistical domination of the population by that part of the community, the fact is that none of the officers involved in these types of things seem to somehow ever have time to venture out of the predominantly black community into the outlying areas where it's still part of their jurisdiction, where there would be the opportunity even to write tickets for fines for other members of other mainstream communities who could also be doing the same things. They somehow seem to find a way to keep their entire 8-hour or 10-hour shift busy, staying right there in the heart of where the African Americans live.
That's a great job again out of you to point that out. Secondly, I hear this a lot too. Why aren't there more African American cops over there? Now, I don't know this. Maybe you do. Is that a situation where the white guys in power in Ferguson are denying black applicants, or in fact African American men there trying to even get on the force? Because if the numbers are low, but they're not trying to get on the force, then whose fault is that really?
Well, number one, when you only have, I'll just use your previous point. You said that the entire area is overwhelmingly and predominantly African American.
Is that not true? That is true.
Absolutely true.
Right.
But the point is, since that is true, not if, but since that is true, then there's no reason why there's only 2 there were only 2 at the time of the Brown shooting, only 2 African Americans on the police force. That is, in fact, a result of the bias that was found in the community. And remember, it not only was just the police department,
what do you mean?
Extended to the justice
but what do you mean?
You had the judge who
I understand that, but you say the bias in the community. Are there examples where African American applicants were turned down, or the folks there are just not trying to get those jobs? Because
you can use the same example that, in fact, Republicans use or Democrats use when they're criticizing unemployment numbers if they're going down on behalf of the benefit of whoever is in the White House. The opposing party will say, well, the reason why the numbers are going down is because so many Americans are dropping out of the workforce, not even bothering to apply because they're so discouraged. So you see, there's a way to spin that so that even if the numbers are going down, which should be a plus for any president, whichever party is in office, the other side can say that it's not a plus. In the same case here, they are not applying. I would make that argument to counter them, that they're not applying because they already know essentially that the fix is in, that they're not going to get through the process because there are too many obstacles in their way.
Fair enough.
You have a judge, the local judge who was part of the conspiracy with extra fines and tickets for African Americans, then you know that it's a very difficult system to have to overcome.
Fair enough.
And that's just permanent.
All right, so we got 2 minutes to go. We actually kept you an extra 11 minutes because you're so damn good, Carl Cheppers. Roy Jones will have to wait. What next?
Don't keep Roy Jones waiting too long, or if he gets angry, believe me,
he gets crazy. He gets very upset. He's a tough guy. Tell me what's next. The Oklahoma thing got nasty. Summer was beautiful. That's a great day, and I'm sure Martin Luther King Jr. would be very, very proud. John Lewis, I thought, was a terrific ambassador too.
Yes.
But between Oklahoma and Ferguson this week, a lot of ugliness still out there. What's in a couple of minutes here, Carl Jeffers? What's next?
We need to be patient. We need to be patient with Ferguson because what's going to happen is that remember, once they finally decide who the leaders are going to be and who's going to have to resign, there will have to be a consent decree between the Department of Justice and the city of Ferguson, and that's going to take some time. In that consent decree, there will be standards and what we call best practices that will be set that will essentially set metrics that the department will have to meet. And these are metrics in terms of standards, in terms of attitudes and so forth. We're not talking about quotas per se. What we're talking about is there's going to have to be reasonable proof demonstrated that the department has made changes that affect the relationship between the community and the police departments. And it's going to involve things like, for instance, we saw this happening in Denver when reports came out that now that they have the body cams on the police officers, they found out that in this first year that only 41% of all encounters between, and that is encounters using force between police and citizens were actually recorded. And they came up with these same lame excuses. Well, it didn't activate. My batteries were dead. I didn't have Duracell. This kind of thing. And that has to stop, Sid. If there's the requirement has to go beyond just providing them with the cams. They have to be required to wear them, and there've got to be sanctions if police officers turn them off as soon as they start to pull over someone so that they don't have to have it recorded, things like that. Those are the kinds of things that Ferguson will have to do in order to satisfy the consent decree, and they will have to demonstrate by showing, yes, in this case, they will have to show some numbers because the previous numbers were so bad that they will have to show that there's more than 2 African Americans on the force.
Sure.
Now, as to how many have to resign at the top, they'll leave, the Justice Department will pretty much leave that to the city of Ferguson, as to whether the mayor resigns or not. The reason why some of these other people were resigning, Sid, is because once they mention your name in these kinds of reports, it's very hard to maintain credibility in public office.
That's ugly.
And these other people, their names were mentioned specifically. That's how much evidence they had as to what their involvement was. So we'll see, but that's what's going to happen there. And I think that the president at the national level needs to take that example of what the Justice Department did find, and used the argument also that this was not a witch hunt because the people there wanted an indictment of Darren Wilson, the officer who shot Brown, and they didn't get that from the Justice Department. The Justice Department said there was not enough evidence. This was a fair, objective report, but this is what African Americans in the end have to count on, because in the beginning, Tom Jackson, the police chief, and all of these people, if it weren't for the federal government under Democratic leadership, they would have never been able to get this level of satisfaction. It would have been done with. Nobody would have resigned. Nothing would have happened. And all that would have happened was that Darren Wilson would not have been indicted, and that would have been an incendiary block for the people. But now the people of Ferguson can be relaxed. And please, folks, don't confuse the people of Ferguson with that punk, as Eric Holder described him, who attacked the police officers in Ferguson the other night. That was nothing, in no way related to the concerns and protests over what's been happening there. That was some essentially animal. I'm going to just say it. It was just an animal who should have been already locked up and apparently has a record, that was long enough to have justified him being put under the jail. And so that's where he belongs. And he is not part of any protest, nor does he set any standards. So that's important to understand. And at the national level, use those standards and enact something legislatively. Republicans want to write a letter that they all sign. Write a letter to the police chiefs of the cities in America. They can respond to it, not the mullahs in Iran. Okay?
Fair enough.
That's what they need to do.
Yeah, I agree. Well, listen, you're brilliant. I love you. I do love you. I really do, Carl. Thank you. A great appearance as always today, and thank you for really shedding some light and doing a terrific job. We love you, Carl Jeffers. Thanks.
Well, I appreciate that, Sid, and I will say this, that next year, with all of the snowbirds, when they get down to Miami from New England, if Indominus Sue ever steps on Tom Brady, that you'll see the kind of reaction that I'm talking about, where the numbers don't matter.
That's funny. That's a great way to end it. Thank you, Carl Jeffers. Thank you so much.